May I see it?
Really?
I got a feeling beneath those jeans is something wonderful just waiting to get out.
Everyone has one thing, you think? I mean, everyone's given one special thing, right?
That's right.
Everyone's blessed with one special thing.
Oh, it's true. This is a giant.
It still blows my mind that at the young age of only 26, Paul Thomas Anderson put together and showed off one of his early masterpieces, Boogie Nights, a lowbrow Shakespearean epic that charts the rise and fall of Dirk Diggler, the brightest star in Hollywood's seediest shadow. The movie follows a large cast of outsiders in search of family, who found themselves tangled up in the world of adult film acting through one of the crucial turning points in the industry, the transition from film to video. What the film might lack in decorum, it more than makes up for in its rich exploration of character, family, fame, sex, and money. But please, don't let the subject matter deter you. I know it's easy to think that a movie like this will be childish and perverted. And look, to some degree it is. But there's a reason this movie has survived cultural relevancy for nearly 3 decades. Boogie Nights is one of the great American works, and in this video, we'll be diving into exactly why that is and how it happened. This is a movie that dared to turn a sleazy footnote in American culture into a tragic, mythic, and deeply human epic. From its own cinematic and storytelling decisions that cemented it into the movie canon, to its incredible development beginning as a short mockumentary directed by Anderson when he was only 17, and the crazy behind-the-scenes stories that almost got the movie derailed. This is the video on Boogie Nights. So buckle up, it's gonna be a fun ride. One of the crucial tensions that makes Boogie Nights so effective is its balance between the explosive energy of its peaks and the emotional guttings of its lows. This back and forth between the mystic highs and real consequences of actions is an idea that's brought to the audience from the very opening image of the film, or I should say, lack of image. It starts off with nothing but a black screen, and we're confronted with the beginning of Michael Penn's original song for the film, The Big Top. For me, this music feels sadly nostalgic, like it's been abandoned. Like a long-held regret you're only just now revealing to yourself, or a reminiscence upon the past. But within that sadness, there's also a faint glimmer of joy or beauty. But once that idea begins to crystallize, even this simple contrast in music tells us an enormous deal about the arc and trajectory of the film. Without realizing it, this small snippet of music at the beginning foreshadows us to a certain inevitable rock bottom we're going to hit, even if we can't help but be taken away by the fun of the disco. Michael Penn describes his music in the oral history of Boogie Nights done by Grantland, saying, "The original music needed to establish a tone that contrasted the escapist disco vibe. And the first thing that I was talking about was just the notion of this dysfunctional family, this sort of cobbled together family that in a slightly altered reality would have been almost circus folk." But the opening doesn't end with that cut from one piece of music to another. While that small decision plants the seed of what's to come, we're quickly forced to stash it away in the back of our minds because of this incredible bravura-filled opening shot that draws us into the party and into the world of Boogie Nights. At this point, the opening shot of Boogie Nights is pretty iconic. I'd say most film people know what I'm talking about when I reference it. But it's still worth discussing because it's crucial to the film. This 3-minute unbroken take, which starts with the operator on a crane pointed at the title of the movie, introduces us perfectly, not only into the world, but also to 7 different crucial characters by giving us snapshots at their language, mannerisms, and desires. As many have already noted, it's reminiscent of the Copacabana oneer done by Scorsese in the middle of Goodfellas. But while Goodfellas uses the introduction through the eyes of Karen after already over an hour into the movie, and while we only stay fixed on that one perspective on the backs of these 2 characters, remaining at the same distance, Boogie Nights attempts to one-up its inspiration. The introduction isn't for a specific character, it's for the audience. It sprawls and turns, not following one couple, but introduces us to an entire ensemble, using whip pans, circling actors, and even changing film speeds. Paul talks about his Scorsese influences in the Neon magazine article listing his 10 influences on Boogie Nights, saying, "This was the first movie to show me techniques I'd spotted in French films being interpreted by a director I was in awe of." He threw the cinematic sink into that movie. Some stuff I did in Boogie Nights is compared to the long traveling shot in the Copacabana, but there have been so many shots like that. You can trace it back to Max Ophuls. What's obnoxious and so fucking brilliant about Scorsese is that he does these pretentious, insane camera moves that suddenly make sense. He's the biggest show-off, and we don't even see it. While PTA denies the influence of the Copacabana shot, I'd say anybody with a pair of eyes who's seen enough movies can spot its influence. Scorsese is all over this film. Paul, of course, talks about Demi and Altman, but with this side-by-side comparison done by, you can see the direct visual language that PTA is stealing from. Stealing, of course, being the nature of cinema, right? Steal, remix, make it your own. And what I love about the interviews with Paul at the time is that he was so open about his cockiness.
I want to see you fuck. I want to see him defuse the bomb. It's exciting.
Which you don't really see that much anymore from filmmakers and actors.
I'm really in pursuit of greatness.
We walked it over and over and over again. Everybody had a clear understanding of what we were doing. It's by far the most complicated thing we did in the movie. Those are not easy shots to set up. It calls for exquisite planning and writing where you don't just get to the crux of the scene and then cut. You gotta write your way through it, and it's a joy to act. But someone who was far less impressed with the opening and with Paul as a director was Burt Reynolds. "Every shot we did, it was like the first time that shot had ever been done. I remember the first shot we did in Boogie Nights, where I drive the car to Grauman's theater. After he said, 'Isn't that amazing?' And I named 5 pictures that had done that same kind of shot." Burt had a lot of problems on that set of Boogie Nights. Also, apologize for that voice. All right, I'm doing my best here. But nevertheless, Burt delivers one of the greatest performances of his career. Despite his rough exterior, he's so warm and inviting, and he always commands the attention and presence of the viewer.
Come on. You are fired. You're fired.
One of the great achievements of Boogie Nights is how it easily manages to convey the thoughts, feelings, and ambitions of so many different characters while still maintaining the core of Dirk's journey and his relationship with Jack and the rest of the ensemble. There are a variety of different ways that he accomplishes this, but one great example from an early scene in the film is when Jack, Amber, and Roller Girl all sit Dirk down and they're trying to convince him to join their fellow troupe of adult film actors. Look at how smoothly the camera glides over away from Jack, leaving Amber, the lone character, on screen. Jack's dialogue almost becomes superfluous to Amber's story and perspective, which focus on Dirk as an object of her attention.
You got maybe 15, 20 guys standing around, just making sure that your lighting is right.
Without any dialogue or exposition, the camera informs us of Amber's ambitions. Her gaze and performance evoke a maternal longing and desire. She sees Dirk in a haloed light, the same way a mother might look at their normal son and see them as the most handsome boy in the world. Crucially, this scene comes after we already know Amber has lost her biological son through divorce. And now, from this simple camera move and performance, we're able to glean that her character arc involves turning Dirk into the child that she never had, making up for the one that she's already lost. But this one instance, though powerful, isn't enough to communicate a character's arc throughout an entire film. The motif, in this instance of maternal projection, is repeated throughout the entire story. After Maurice fails to get a hold of Amber at the party, it cuts to a slowed shot of her doing a line, then once more fixing her gaze upon Dirk, the child that she ultimately chooses. And it isn't until later that the consequences of these actions finally catch up with her. And that level of subtle filmmaking to convey psychological details about characters is not specific to Amber. PTA gives almost every major player in this ensemble a core motivation, an inner ache, a dream just out of reach. We're able to have these ridiculous comedic moments like,
Yeah, those are really cool. Are they lizard?
No, they're Italian.
because we also have the grounded moments and reality that These people are porn actors, and with that lifestyle comes a certain amount of consequences.
You're not being fair. This isn't fair.
They aren't caricatures because Paul treats them as if they're real people with real ambitions and real dreams, and they're photographed with the utmost sincerity. The adult film industry is portrayed as just that, an industry, and being an adult film star is nothing more than a job. It would have been easy to have each character be a ridiculous caricature, or to treat the porn world as completely depraved. When Little Bill or Jack talk about the production of their movies, it sounds like any film crew talking about any movie.
You know, you've got your camera, you got your film, you got your lights, you got your sound, you got your lab costs, you got your developing, you got your syncing, you got your editing. Before you turn around, you spent maybe $20, $25, $30,000 on a movie.
When Jack talks about his ambitions as a director, it sounds like any director talking about their ambitions.
That's my dream, to make a film that is true and right and dramatic.
It's this level of care and realism that Paul applies to the little moments that transcends this film from one crazy genre movie about porn to something worth studying and rewatching and being critical of.
Eddie Adams from Torrance.
As Grantland's oral history of Boogie Nights eloquently puts it, Boogie Nights began as a teenage boy's wet dream. The only reason Paul was able to write and shoot and edit this movie with such verite is because of his unique exposure to that industry growing up.
It always sort of surrounded me in a peripheral way, you know.
Nearly a decade before the release of Boogie Nights, a 17-year-old PTA was already obsessed with porn, yes, but more so with the little weird corner of Hollywood that San Fernando Valley liked to call home. While most teens that watched were in it for the sex, he was curious about the people making the things that people jacked off to. That obsession birthed the Dirk Diggler story, a 32-minute mockumentary about the pursuit, delusions, and fallout of fame. A few actors from that short film actually carried over into the feature, like the Colonel, and the actor that played Dirk Diggler is the first customer that Buck tries to sell his THX modification to. With the Dirk Diggler story under his belt and the bruising experience of having his debut feature, Sydney, later retitled Hard 8, ripped from his hands and taken by the studio, Anderson came into Boogie Nights with not only a chip on his shoulder, but a story that he'd been wanting to tell ever since he was a high school kid. Reflecting on the experience of his first feature, PTA told a reporter, "It created a sort of paranoia and guardedness in me that I'm glad I have, because that will never, ever happen to me again." So when he set out to make Boogie Nights, it wasn't just personal, it was war. Compromise was a dirty word. Luckily, he found an ally in Mike DeLuca from New Line Cinema, who trusted the young PTA. It was easier for us to take chances with new people than compete for already established top 5 directors in town. DeLuca later said, "We tried to zig when the majors zagged." Anderson came to the project with 2 big points he wanted to maintain. This movie was going to be 3 hours long, and it was going to be NC-17. DeLuca, on the other hand, was adamant that he give up at least one of these 2 points, either trim the runtime or make it be R-rated. In the end, PTA chose the latter. The prep period on Boogie Nights lasted 8 weeks. We watched every existing porno that was ever shot on film. We went to see guys who had vast libraries, and some of it was shot on 35mm film, like period gangster films. It was astonishing. They cost like $100,000. I interviewed George Damiano, and he was the best of the hardcore directors, and he went through a special period believing he could make art films about sex. Home video came along in 1979 and destroyed that illusion. Paul wanted to deal with the transition between people really making movies, shooting them on motion picture film, projecting them in theaters, having audiences come and see them, and then what porno turned into. And with a $15 million budget, they were ready and on their way. But the production wasn't without its battles. Behind the camera, tension was growing, none more explosive than the clash between the young, headstrong director and his most seasoned star. Paul Thomas Anderson was only in his mid-20s, fresh out of Sundance, and suddenly he found himself directing one of Hollywood's oldest and greatest stars. Burt Reynolds was a legend, an icon, and as it turned out, deeply proud. He didn't take well to being told what to do by a fucking little punk kid. Their relationship, Paul's and Burt's, became one of the most volatile and fascinating dynamics on set. Now, I could try to paraphrase how it all went down, but truthfully, it sounds so much better coming straight from the horse's mouth, from the people that were actually there. Burt was frustrated because Paul was not allowing him to do free takes, a sense of going off the page. There was also a bit of jealousy about the attention that Mark was getting as Dirk Diggler, a part that Burt probably would have loved to play when he was younger. Burt did not think Paul respected him, and Burt, respect is extremely important to him. Like many actors, he is frail in terms of his ego, and Paul didn't really understand that. He probably understands it much better now. Burt got so frustrated he pulled Paul outside into the backyard and started yelling at him, like a father, You fucking little punk kid, don't tell me what to do. You let all the other actors do free takes and you're not letting me do any. He read him the riot act. Paul stood there and took it in and then argued back with him. And then when they walked back into the house, Paul had this sly little smirk on his face. I had to pull Burt's arm back when it was cocked. I was in the middle of it. Burt was getting ready to slug him and I was like, Burt, no, don't do it. And then I had to take Burt back to the trailer and I spent a lot of time in Burt's trailer. A lot. I loved Burt. I thought he was incredible. He was old Hollywood. There were a lot of people on that set that just didn't really have the time or the interest in it. The reason I think that Paul baited Burt is that the next day we shot the scene in the backyard by the pool where Jack tells Dirk to do the scene and Dirk says, "It's my big I want to do whatever the I want." And the two of them get into a shoving match. And all that energy between those characters was real energy that had been building and manifesting over the weeks prior. And then it exploded all in that scene on camera. Paul was directing this big, sprawling movie, and I just think for whatever reason he was like, I don't have the mental or emotional space to give Burt what he needs from me. By the time we got to that moment, Burt was just like a tinderbox, and Paul provoked him slightly and he blew. I think Paul was physically afraid that day. After that, Burt went to work on his end of the deal, and Paul went to work, and they were gracious to each other. They seemed very professional about everything, and it went swell from then on. In between setups, all the actors would sit on the floor, all around Burt Reynolds in a big puffy chair. Luis Guzman and the roller girl and all of us, We'd all be there. We'd all sit down and Burt would tell stories about acting in the 50s in New York City and Marlon Brando and James Dean. The tension between Paul and Burt didn't last forever. Years later, in interviews, Reynolds, who famously had said that he never watched Boogie Nights, softened a little bit, and he spoke with more grace and more perspective.
I'm glad I did it, and the director did a fabulous job, and I was wrong and he was right, but I just had a really hard time with some of the dialogue, saying some of the words.
So with all that under his belt, once Boogie Nights wrapped production, PTA assumed that the hardest part had been over. But he was wrong. For starters, none of the post-production supervisors at New Line wanted to touch the film. One of them even called it, the CP word. And then came along the MPAA with their endless requests for removal of certain overly sexualized parts of the movie. Now, anyone who's seen the film knows that it isn't hyper-sexualized. Of course, there are sex scenes, but there are also sex scenes in tons of sex comedies. There especially were lots of them in the 90s and 80s and years past. But for whatever reason, the MPAA was hung up on the nudity in this film, specifically Mark Wahlberg's butt cheeks. The editors would trim 20 frames from a scene, submit it again, only to be told, Dirk's butt, too much. Then they would cut off another 6 frames and resubmit, only to get back the same note. They did this 18 times. 18 submissions, an MPAA record. Paul fought every step of the way. When someone at New Line would tell him to pick his battles, he would respond back saying, "You never pick and choose your battles. If you feel passionately about something, you go after it." When the editing was finally done, he sent what he considered to be the director's cut to his cinematographer, Robert Elswit. As Elswit and his wife were watching, she got up and left halfway through the screening and called it a piece of doggy doo-doo. The feedback? It was long, indulgent, and bloated, full of moments that he clearly loved but just didn't add up together. The first cut ran 3 hours and 1 minute, exactly the length of the original script. And it included everything. Dirk's parents' death, Becky and Jerome's marriage ending in violence, and Sarah Lynn living in Dirk's childhood home. It was strange, melancholy, and it tested terribly. New Line studio head Bob Shea started to panic. At one point, Bob even made his own cut of the film, and he went to PTA trying to persuade him. He suggested that they set up a test screening with Bob's own cut of the film, which they did. If his cut scored higher than PTA's, he would at least have to listen and make a few alterations. Paul reluctantly agreed, but as the line started to form outside of the screening room, Paul went down the line and told each and every member of the audience who was about to go watch the movie, "This movie sucks. You're gonna hate it." And maybe his influencing worked because they kinda did. Bob's version scored significantly lower than Paul's. Nevertheless, changes were made to the cut. The eventual running time of the film is about 2.5 hours without credits. PTA realized that all of the conclusions, Dirk's parents dying, Becky and Jerome's marriage failing, Sarah Lynn living in his old childhood home, they detracted from the root and the core of the story, which is Dirk and his surrogate family. In the end, it was still Paul's cut that made it to theaters. It's just that his cut and his mind had been changed. But it was still his, it was still long, it was still Boogie Nights. For a movie about the biggest penis being attached to the biggest idiot, it's kind of amazing that it is so good and has had such a profound impact on the culture of movies. Upon release, Roger Ebert gave it the perfect 4 out of 4, saying, "Boogie Nights has the quality of many great films, in that it always seems alive. A movie can be very good and yet not draw us in, not involve us in the moment-to-moment sensation of seeing lives as they are lived. As a writer and director, Paul Thomas Anderson is a skilled reporter who fills the screen with understated, authentic details. To this day, it is being referenced by directors and continues to inspire the next generation of filmmakers. At least I know while I was in film school, I was always trying to rip it off, and I knew a lot of people who were also. Almost as many people trying to rip it off as there are people trying to rip off Pulp Fiction. It would have been easy for Paul to shoot a movie that uses sex the same way pornos do. But that isn't the film that he wanted to make. As Robert Elswit puts it, Paul's movies are about really one thing: families. They're about someone trying to create a family, find a family, get rid of one they have, create a new one. But it's everything everybody is seeking: love, acceptance, redemption. It all happens inside a family. And the family that they try to create in Boogie Nights are these people making these porno movies. Where most films use sex as a way to turn us on, Boogie Nights reminds us that the sex on screen isn't about pleasure, it's about performance. What we're watching is a product being manufactured again and again and again and again. And by the time we watch that final shot, the same one that the Colonel couldn't stop staring at, there's no illusion left. Whatever it once was is now just a commodity. And when Dirk, coked out and unraveling, screams at Jack, we understand the full weight of it. He's not just desperate to work, he's desperate to be used. Because in that world, your body is your currency, and who can blame them? Rejects from the outside world, they, like all of us, are on this incredible journey looking for love, looking for a family, looking to be seen. There's so much more information that I wanted to include in this video, like the story behind Little Bill and his wife that was actually portrayed by a real porn star in the movie. Allegedly, there's one scene that actually didn't make the cut. It's when he kills them at the New Year's Eve party. Allegedly, they were actually having sex during that scene. I also wanted to bring up the production behind the Alfred Molina scene, which is just like one of the most legendary like ending scenes of a movie of all time. It's kind of like the culmination of what the whole movie is about, you know, comedy, sadness, fear, all of that is encapsulated into that one scene, you know, reaching your rock bottom and then striving for redemption. You know, think about that shot of Dirk just sitting there and it's like on him for 2 minutes straight and he's just zoned out. That is the pivotal shot of the whole movie. And apparently some of the stories say that he was just zoned out because they had been shooting that for 2 days straight, lighting off firecrackers every 30 seconds or so. And Mark Wahlberg was just out of it. And PTA just had the cameras rolling without him really realizing. And how could I forget? I didn't really mention the prosthetic penis either. I think the first version that they made was something like 13 inches long, but then Mark, he's only like 5'7", it took up like 1/5 of his body. And so it just wasn't working at all. And so they ended up going with a 7 or an 8-inch one, which still looks pretty big in comparison to Mark. And like the way he had to put it on and like show it to everyone was just hilarious. All this information that I got was pretty much taken from a few resources, but the number one that I would recommend you read is Living Thing, The Oral History by Grantland that I mentioned. It's like the greatest resource on Boogie Nights out there. It's such a fun read. If you have the time, go give it a read. This video, for being as long as it is, only scratches the surface of all the info that's out there on this movie. And like I was saying, there's so much I wanted to include, and I kind of think that just speaks to the quality of the film. And like how many films can you say have articles upon articles of like dedicated research done on them and like oral histories made on them? It's only I can only really think of movies like Star Wars, you know, Marvel movies, franchise movies, but he was just some 26-year-old kid that made this film, and so much has spawned from it, so much information, and it's because people love it. People obsess over it, and that's kind of what Paul was. He was this obsessive kid that obsessed about movies, and he made something that people themselves want to obsess over. And you know, that's the beauty of movie making. That's the kind of stuff that I think, you know, isn't necessarily that present all the time in movies that come out these days, and that's why I think it's so important for, you know, my generation that will be coming up behind us, and you know, the generation right above us, to keep making stuff, to keep obsessing, to keep pouring your hearts into everything, because you end up making great art, and you end up making stuff that, you know, lasts the test of time. Most movies don't have a shelf life longer than a year, 2 years, and this, I imagine I'm still going to be watching it 2 decades from now, and I imagine it'll still hit in a similar way. Yeah, I also want to say I wish I could have like done more straight up analysis of the movie, but I didn't want to just make an analysis video, and I didn't want to just make a behind the scenes video. I hope this is kind of a combination of the two. If you want a more straightforward analysis of Boogie Nights video, let me know, because I will be happy to make it. I can, take it from a completely different approach. I can look exclusively on like the dolly, right, or the zoom lens or whatever. Yeah, but I think, like I already said, it just goes to show how I don't know, like there's so much I'm still not saying. It just goes to show how cool Boogie Nights is. So if you haven't seen it, go check it out. Right. Thank you if you're still watching this. Oh, I didn't say that's a wrap. Anyway. And I also haven't been saying, here are my sources. Here are my sources. That's a wrap on Boogie Nights. Drop a comment. Smash like. Smash subscribe. Sorry. Jesus. Sorry, neighbors. I heard my neighbor literally come in 2 seconds ago.